Jerusalem was restless that night. The city breathed tension. Lamps flickered in narrow streets. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. And somewhere in the darkness, a plan was already in motion. This was not the beginning of a trial. It was the beginning of a verdict decided long before any evidence would be heard. Jesus of Nazareth had just left the Mount of Olives. His words were still echoing in the hearts of his followers, words about faith, sacrifice, and a kingdom not built by human hands. But while his disciples struggled to understand his warnings, powerful men were already preparing to silence him. This trial would not begin in a courtroom. It would begin in secrecy, under the cover of night. Armed guards moved quickly toward the Garden of Gethsemane. Torches cut through the darkness. Steel glinted in firelight. And at the front of them stood Judas Iscariot, a familiar face carrying a dangerous purpose. A kiss meant to be a symbol of love was about to become a mark of betrayal. When Jesus was arrested, there was no resistance from him, no attempt to escape, no call for defense. Instead, there was calm, a calm so unsettling that it exposed the fear of those who had come to seize him. One of his disciples struck out in anger, but Jesus stopped him immediately. Violence was not the way. The story unfolding that night would be written in restraint, not rebellion. Bound and taken away, Jesus was led first to honors, the former high priest. This alone broke the rules. Jewish law demanded fairness, witnesses, and daylight. But none of that mattered now. The leaders weren't searching for truth. They were searching for justification. Questions were thrown at him. Accusations followed, but every charge collapsed under its own weight. Witnesses contradicted each other. Lies tangled with half-truths. Still, Jesus remained silent not because he was powerless, but because this silence carried a weight louder than any defense. As dawn approached, the fate of Jesus was already tilting toward injustice. The trial would move from religious leaders to Roman authority, from whispered accusations to public pressure. And with every step, the distance between justice and the law would grow wider. This was not just the trial of a man. This was the moment humanity put truth on. Trialand didn't realize what it was about to lose. When false voices sought to become truth, the night was still heavy when the questioning continued. Inside the high priest's courtyard, shadows clung to the walls as tightly as fear clung to the hearts of those in power. Jesus stood alone, surrounded by men who believed that if they could control the narrative, they could control the outcome. But truth is never comfortable when it stands in chains. According to Jewish law, a trial demanded credible witnesses, clear testimonies that agreed in detail. What happened instead was chaos. One witness stepped forward, then another, and another after that. Each story sounded convincing on its own, but when placed side by side, they collapsed. Their words clashed, timelines shifted, accusations changed shape. Lies, no matter how confidently spoken, could not stand together. Some claimed Jesus threatened to destroy the temple. Others twisted his teachings, ripping them from context, reshaping them into something dangerous. They tried to make him sound like a revolutionary, a threat to both religion and order. Yet even in their desperation, they failed. Their testimonies did not agree, and the law they claimed to protect was being broken with every passing minute. Throughout it all, Jesus remained silent. This silence wasn't weakness, it was exposure. Every false word spoken against him only revealed the fear of those who spoke it. The high priest grew frustrated. Silence could not be controlled. Silence could not be cornered. So he decided to force a response. Standing before everyone, he demanded an answer, an oath that would place Jesus under divine obligation. The room held its breath. This was the moment they were waiting for. If Jesus spoke, they would seize his words. If he stayed silent, they would call it guilt. And then he answered. His voice was steady, clear, and unshaken. He did not argue. He did not defend himself with clever speech. Instead, he spoke truth directly, without fear. He acknowledged who he was, not in defiance, but in certainty. That single declaration changed everything. The high priest tore his robes, a dramatic act meant to signal outrage. Blasphemy, he cried. But the decision had already been made. The charge was no longer about evidence. It was about authority threatened and power exposed. With that word, the trial crossed a line. Justice was officially abandoned. The truth had spoken, and for that, it would be punished. As morning approached, Jesus was declared deserving of death. The law they claimed to uphold lay shattered at their feet. And this was only the beginning. When the verdict turned into violence, the decision had been declared, but the night was not yet finished. Inside the courtyard, justice no longer even pretended to exist. Once the word blasphemy was spoken, restraint vanished. Law stepped aside, and cruelty took its place. Jesus was no longer treated as a man standing trial. He was treated as an object of rage. The guards moved in first. Hands that were meant to enforce order became tools of abuse. They blindfolded him, mocking his claim of insight and truth. Strikes came without warning, sharp, humiliating, deliberate. Each blow was followed by laughter, by taunts meant to strip him of dignity. Prophesy, they sneered. Tell us who hit you. This was not punishment under law. This was mob behavior wearing the uniform of authority. Still, Jesus did not respond with anger. He did not curse his attackers. He did not beg. Every insult landed against silence. And that silence did something unsettling. It forced his abusers to face their own ugliness. Violence loses its power when it cannot provoke hatred in return. Nearby, in the outer courtyard, another trial was unfolding, one no less painful. Peter, the disciple who once swore unwavering loyalty, stood warming himself by a fire. Faces turned toward him. Questions followed. Aren't you one of his followers? Fear crept in. One denial, then another, and then a third. When the rooster crowed, the sound cut through the night like a blade. At that exact moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. No accusation, no anger, just awareness. Peter broke down, crushed by the weight of his own weakness. The contrast was undeniable, one man standing firm in silence, another collapsing under fear. As dawn approached, the religious leaders regrouped. They knew they had a problem. Under Roman rule, they did not have the authority to carry out an execution. Their verdict meant nothing unless Rome approved it. So the strategy changed. The charge would shift. Blasphemy meant nothing to Roman law. Politics, however, meant everything. Jesus would no longer be presented as a religious offender, but as a political threat, someone claiming kingship, someone dangerous to imperial order. Bound once more, Jesus was prepared for transfer from the hands of religious authority to the grip of Roman power. From secret night trials to public spectacle, the violence had already begun. But something far greater was coming. Because when fear meets power, truth becomes the most dangerous enemy of all. A governor caught between power and truth. Morning light washed over Jerusalem as Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Unlike the secret proceedings of the night, this trial unfolded in the open, under the watchful eyes of both soldiers and citizens. Yet even in daylight, justice remained elusive. Pilate was no stranger to rebellion. He had crushed uprisings before, silenced voices that threatened Roman order. But the man standing before him did not fit the pattern. Jesus bore the marks of abuse, yet his presence was calm, unshaken, unafraid. There was no desperation in his eyes, no hint of revolution in his stance. The religious leaders wasted no time. They refrained their accusations carefully. This was no longer about blasphemy. They charged Jesus with stirring unrest, misleading the people, and claiming to be a king. That word king was deliberate. It was meant to trigger Rome's deepest fear, a challenge to Caesar's authority. Pilate questioned Jesus directly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" The question was sharp, political, and dangerous. Jesus answered without defensiveness. He did not deny the title, but neither did he claim power the way Rome understood it. He spoke of a kingdom not of this world, one not built on violence, borders, or armies. Pilate listened closely. This was not the language of a rebel. This was something else entirely. Confused, Pilate turned back to the crowd and did something unexpected. He declared, "I find no fault in this man." It should have ended there, but the leaders pressed harder. They accused Jesus of stirring the people from Galilee to Jerusalem. When Pilate heard the word Galilee, he saw an opportunity. Galilee fell under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, not Rome. Responsibility could be shifted. Decision could be delayed. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. Herod, curious rather than concerned, hoped for entertainment. He questioned Jesus at length, eager to see a miracle. But Jesus remained silent. No signs, no spectacle. Frustrated and insulted, Herod mocked him, dressing him in a robe to parody kingship, and sent him back. The burden returned to Pilate. He now knew two things. Jesus was innocent, and the crowd would not accept that verdict. Pressure began to build from religious leaders, from political risk, from the threat of unrest. Pilate stood at the center of a storm where truth demanded courage, and power demanded compromise. And compromise was far easier. When the crowd learned to decide, Pilate stood before the crowd, and for the first time that morning, he hesitated. He had examined Jesus, questioned him, and sent him away only to receive him back unchanged. Every instinct told Pilate the same truth: this man was innocent. But truth, in the presence of a crowd, often becomes fragile. The religious leaders sensed Pilate's uncertainty and pressed in. Their voices sharpened, their accusations grew louder. They no longer argued law, they argued fear. They warned Pilate that releasing Jesus would make him an enemy of Caesar. It was a calculated threat. In the Roman world, loyalty to the emperor was everything. One accusation of sympathy toward a rival king could end a career or a life. Pilate searched for a way out. It was then he remembered a custom. During the Passover, one prisoner could be released to the people. A gesture of mercy, a symbolic act meant to calm the city. Pilate saw an opportunity to avoid bloodshed without openly defying the crowd. He presented them with a choice. On one side stood Jesus, silent, bruised, and calm. On the other stood Barabbas, a known criminal, guilty of rebellion and violence. The contrast could not have been clearer. Pilate expected reason to prevail. He was wrong. The leaders moved through the crowd like a current, whispering, urging, shaping opinion. Voices began to rise. "Release Barabbas," they shouted. Again and again, the chant grew stronger, feeding on itself. Fear turned into momentum. Momentum turned into demand. Pilate was stunned. He asked the question that should have ended everything. "What shall I do with Jesus?" The answer came back like thunder. "Crucify him." Pilate pushed back, weakly at first, then with growing frustration. Why? What crime has he committed? But the crowd no longer needed a reason. They had been taught what to want. Their shouts drowned out logic, drowned out justice. Seeing the situation slipping beyond control, Pilate performed a symbolic act. He washed his hands before the people, declaring himself innocent of Jesus' blood. It was a public gesture meant to ease his conscience, but it changed nothing. Authority cannot escape responsibility through ceremony. The verdict was sealed. Jesus was handed over to be flogged and crucified not because he was guilty, but because the crowd demanded it, and power was too afraid to resist. This moment revealed something chilling. When fear leads, the crowd will always choose what feels safest, even if it means killing the truth. When pain became a public spectacle, the decision was made, and Rome moved quickly. Once a prisoner was handed over for crucifixion, mercy disappeared. Jesus was taken by the soldiers, not as a man awaiting judgment, but as a body already claimed by punishment. The scourging came first. Roman flogging was designed to break a person before the cross ever touched their shoulders. Jesus was stripped and bound to a post. The whip embedded with bone and metal rose and fell again and again. Each strike tore into flesh, meant to weaken, humiliate, and terrify. This was not justice. This was domination. Rome did not simply punish bodies. It crushed spirits. Yet even here, Jesus did not scream for mercy. The soldiers, bored and cruel, turned suffering into entertainment. They dressed him in a purple robe, a mockery of royalty. They twisted thorns into a crown and pressed it onto his head, driving pain deep into his skin. Kneeling before him, they bowed in fake reverence, laughing as they spat and struck him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Every word was soaked in sarcasm. Every action was meant to strip him of identity. But the irony was heavy. While they mocked his kingship, they unknowingly testified to it. Pilate brought Jesus back before the crowd, battered and bleeding. "Behold the man," he said, as if the sight of suffering might awaken compassion. But compassion had already been silenced. The crowd saw weakness, not innocence. Pain did not soften their hearts, it hardened them. The chief priests cried out again, "Crucify him." Their voices carried urgency now, as if delay itself was dangerous. When Pilate hesitated one final time, they delivered their sharpest weapon. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar." That was the line Pilate could not cross. Power bowed to fear. With a final order, Pilate handed Jesus over to the execution squad. The sentence was complete, the process unstoppable. The soldiers placed the crossbeam on Jesus' shoulders. Already weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, he staggered under its weight. Step by step, he was led through the streets, through the same city that had once welcomed him with praise. Now, there were no hosannas, only stares, only silence, only the sound of wood scraping against stone. This was Rome's message to the world. This is what happens when truth stands in the way of power, and the road ahead led only to Golgotha, the road where hope was meant to die. The journey to Golgotha was slow and merciless. Roman law demanded that the condemned carry the instrument of their own execution, a final display of humiliation and warning. The crossbeam pressed against Jesus' torn back, each step reopening wounds that had barely begun to clot. Weak from blood loss, his body swayed under the weight not just of wood, but of what it represented. The streets of Jerusalem lined the path. Some watched in silence, unwilling to look away yet afraid to speak. Others followed out of curiosity, treating suffering like spectacle. A few mocked, shaking their heads at the fallen teacher who once spoke of love and truth. The city that had heard his voice now heard only his labored breathing. Before long, Jesus collapsed. The soldiers did not slow the march. They seized a man from the proud Simon of Cyrene and forced him to carry the cross behind Jesus. It was not an act of mercy, but of efficiency. Rome wanted the execution completed. The message had to be delivered. As they moved on, women in the crowd wept openly. Their cries cut through the noise, filled with grief and disbelief. Jesus turned to them, even in his exhaustion. He did not ask for pity. Instead, he spoke words that echoed with warning and compassion, urging them to weep not for him, but for what was coming. Even on the road to death, his concern reached beyond himself. Golgotha came into view, a place of execution, barren and exposed. The name itself meant the place of the skull. Rome chose such locations deliberately. Death here was public. Shame here was permanent. The soldiers wasted no time. They offered Jesus wine mixed with a numbing agent, a small mercy meant to dull pain. He refused it. He would face what was coming with full awareness. There would be no escape through unconsciousness. They stripped him again, dividing his garments among themselves. Even in his final moments, greed found a place. Lots were cast for his clothing, fulfilling ancient words spoken long before this day arrived. The cross was laid flat. Nails were driven through flesh into wood, sharp, final, unforgiving. With practiced precision, the soldiers lifted the cross upright, dropping it into place with a jolt that sent pain surging through his body. Above his head, a sign was fixed: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Intended as mockery, it stood as an unintentional proclamation. Here, on this hill, Rome believed it was ending a problem. It did not know it was beginning a story the world would never escape. The road to Golgotha. The journey from Pilate's judgment hall to Golgotha was not long in distance, but it was infinite in pain. Jesus, already beaten and bloodied from the scourging, was forced to carry his own cross, the instrument of his death. The rough wood pressed into his raw shoulders, each step tearing at bruised flesh. Every stumble drew laughter and jeers from the soldiers, who treated his suffering as spectacle rather than mercy. Crowds lined the streets, some in sorrow, some in curiosity, and others in cruelty. Women wept openly, their grief piercing through the clamor of mockery. Jesus turned toward them, offering words of warning and hope. "Do not weep for me," he said, "but for yourselves and for your children." Even in agony, his concern extended beyond his own suffering, revealing a heart focused on humanity, not revenge. The soldiers, indifferent to his pain, pressed onward. When Jesus faltered, they forced Simon of Cyrene from the crowd to carry the cross behind him. Simon's reluctant obedience mirrored the unwilling participation of a world that often witnesses injustice but hesitates to intervene. Yet, even in this grim procession, God's plan moved forward. Every stumble, every fall, was part of a greater purpose that few could comprehend. Along the path, the city transformed into a theater of cruelty. Bystanders cursed, taunted, and mocked, testing the limits of his endurance. Yet Jesus did not retaliate. He walked in silence, absorbing the weight of human sin and the pain of injustice. Every step was a testament, every fall a teaching. The road to Golgotha was not just a physical journey, it was a spiritual demonstration of unwavering obedience and compassion. Finally, the hill came into view. Golgotha, the place of the skull, loomed like a sentence carved in stone. Its barren expanse awaited the execution, a stage prepared for humiliation and suffering. Jesus, already weakened, struggled to carry the cross up the hill. The soldiers pushed, jeered, and pressed him forward. Even as the shadows of death grew long, Jesus remained conscious of the mission ahead. The crowd may have sought shame, the soldiers enforced brutality, and the world expected silence, but he would speak through suffering, and history would record every moment. The journey ended at Golgotha, the cross laid upon the ground, ready to receive him. What began as a public punishment was about to become the greatest revelation of courage, obedience, and love the world has ever witnessed. Darkness at noon and the weight of silence. By the time the cross stood firmly in the ground, the world around it began to change. What started as a public execution slowly turned into something far more unsettling. The sky, once clear, grew heavy. By midday, darkness spread across the land, an unnatural shadow falling at an unnatural hour. It was as if creation itself paused to witness what humanity was doing. Jesus hung between heaven and earth, suspended in agony. Every breath was a struggle. To inhale, he had to push against the nails tearing through his flesh. To exhale, he had to collapse back into pain. Crucifixion was designed not just to kill, but to prolong suffering, to make death a slow negotiation with the body. Around him, reactions varied. Some in the crowd grew uneasy. Mockery faded into nervous silence. Others doubled down, choosing cruelty over reflection. The religious leaders scoffed, shouting that if he truly was chosen by God, he should save himself. They failed to understand that staying on the cross was not weakness. It was obedience to a mission they could not see. One of the criminals crucified beside him joined the mockery at first, echoing the crowd's words, but the other saw something different. In the midst of pain, he recognized innocence. Turning his head with what little strength he had left, he acknowledged his own guilt and asked Jesus to remember him. The request was small, almost desperate. Jesus answered with a promise that cut through the darkness, a promise of hope beyond death. Even while suffocating, he offered assurance. Even while dying, he gave life. As the hours passed, the silence grew heavier. Then Jesus spoke words that carried unimaginable weight, words of abandonment. Echoing ancient scripture, it was not despair without meaning. It was the cry of someone bearing a burden meant for others. In that moment, isolation reached its deepest point. Pain was no longer only physical, it was spiritual. The earth responded. The ground trembled. Rocks split. The unseen barrier within the temple tore from top to bottom, as if heaven itself declared that something final had taken place. Access once restricted was now open. Separation was collapsing. When Jesus cried out again, his voice was not defeated. It was resolved. With a final breath, he surrendered his spirit, not taken from him, but willingly given. The execution squad had seen many die, but never like this. One of them, hardened by years of violence, spoke words that would echo far beyond Golgotha. This man was different. Darkness began to lift, but nothing would ever return to how it was before. Because the silence that followed his death was not empty, it was full of meaning. When death thought it had won, when the final breath left Jesus' body, the hill of Golgotha fell into an uneasy stillness. The cries, the insults, the shouting, all of it faded. What remained was silence, heavy and unsettling. Rome had done what it always did. The execution was complete. The threat, they believed, was finished. But something felt wrong. The Roman centurion stood watching the lifeless body on the cross. He had overseen countless executions, witnessed men curse, beg, and collapse into nothing. This death was different. There had been control, purpose, and a strange authority even in surrender. The centurion spoke quietly, almost to himself, acknowledging what fear and pride had tried to suppress. This man was righteous. This man was not ordinary. As evening approached, urgency returned. Jewish law required that bodies not remain on crosses after sunset, especially with the Sabbath nearing. What had begun in violence now moved toward haste. The same leaders who had demanded death now wanted distance from it. A man named Joseph of Arimathea stepped forward, quiet, respected, and unexpected. He had not consented to the verdict. Risking his position, he went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised. Death had come quickly. After confirmation, permission was granted. The body was taken down, gently, far more gently than it had been treated in life. Jesus was wrapped in linen and spices. There was no procession, no honor, only a few faithful followers, hearts broken, hands trembling. They worked quickly, racing against the setting sun. A new tomb lay nearby, cut into stone, untouched by death until now. Jesus was placed inside. The stone was rolled across the entrance final, heavy, absolute. To the world, this was the end of the story, but fear still lingered among the authorities. The memory of his words haunted them. He had spoken of rising again. They did not believe him, but they feared the possibility. So they returned to Pilate, requesting guards. Rome obliged. The tomb was sealed. Soldiers were stationed. Power surrounded death, determined to keep it contained. The disciples scattered, hiding behind locked doors. Hope felt buried with the body. Promises sounded distant. The future looked empty. And yet, beneath the silence of that sealed tomb, something unstoppable was already at work. Because truth does not stay buried, light does not remain sealed, and death does not get the final word. What appeared to be victory was only a pause. A tomb that refused to stay silent. Night settled over Jerusalem, but the tomb did not rest alone. Roman soldiers stood guard, their armor catching the faint glow of torches. The stone sealing the entrance was heavy, official, and secure, backed by imperial authority. To the leaders, this was insurance. No body could be stolen. No story could be invented. The chapter was closed, or so they believed. Inside the city, fear ruled the disciples. Doors were locked, windows were covered. The same crowd that had demanded crucifixion now felt unpredictable, dangerous. If Jesus could be executed, anyone associated with him could be next. Hope had collapsed into confusion. They replayed his words again and again, unsure whether to believe them or mourn their loss. At the tomb, the soldiers kept watch through the dark hours. They had seen death before. A sealed grave was not something to fear. Stone does not move. Bodies do not rise. Rome did not prepare for miracles, only for rebellion. Then the ground began to tremble. It was sudden and violent. The earth shook beneath their feet, not like distant thunder, but like something tearing reality open. Before the soldiers could react, a blinding presence descended. Light overwhelmed darkness. The stone was rolled away not by human hands, but by power beyond resistance. The guards froze. Strength failed them. Trained men collapsed in terror, powerless in the face of something they could not fight or command. The tomb stood open, and it was empty. At dawn, women approached the tomb, carrying spices, acts of devotion, not expectation. They came to honor a dead teacher, not to witness history rewritten. Their steps slowed when they saw the stone moved. Fear and confusion flooded in. Inside, there was no body, no trace of theft, only silence and a message that shattered grief. He was not there. He had risen, just as he said. Terror turned to awe. Mourning turned to wonder. The impossible had happened. The guards fled, shaken, reporting what they had seen. The leaders panicked. Authorities scrambled for control. A story was quickly manufactured. Money changed hands. Silence was bought. Lies were spread. The truth had to be contained. But truth does not bend easily. An empty tomb speaks louder than sealed stone. Soldiers cannot guard against life. Power cannot imprison resurrection. What was meant to end a movement became its beginning. Because the trial of Jesus did not conclude at death, it continued in the response to resurrection, and the world would never be the same. From locked doors to living witnesses, Jerusalem woke to rumors that refused to stay quiet. Whispers moved through streets and markets, passed in lowered voices and startled glances. The tomb was empty. The body was gone. Authorities tried to control the story, but questions spread faster than answers. Something had happened and everyone could feel it. Behind locked doors, the disciples remained frozen by fear. They had heard the women's words, but disbelief wrestled with hope. Grief still weighed heavily on their hearts. They had seen him die. They had watched the stone seal the tomb. Resurrection sounded too impossible to trust. Then, without warning, he stood among them. No knock, no opened door, just presence. Fear exploded into shock. Hearts raced. Some thought they were seeing a ghost, but Jesus spoke with calm authority, the same voice they had followed for years. He showed them his hands and his side. The wounds were real. The body was real. Death had not erased him, it had transformed him. Their fear began to crack. He spoke words of peace, not rebuke. He did not shame them for running or hiding. Instead, he breathed reassurance into their panic. What had been lost was being restored. What had been broken was being rebuilt. Thomas was not there that night. When the others told him what they had seen, he refused to believe. He demanded proof, something solid, something undeniable. Days later, Jesus appeared again. This time, Thomas was present. He invited him to touch the wounds, to confront the evidence. Doubt collapsed into surrender. Faith was no longer borrowed, it was earned. Outside the city, the risen Jesus met his followers again and again. On roads, by the sea, in quiet moments, and shared meals. These were not brief visions. These were encounters. Lives were being reshaped by undeniable reality. The same men who once fled in fear now listened with new purpose. His instructions were clear. They were not to hide. They were not to stay silent. They were to speak openly, boldly, without fear of consequence. The trial had ended in a way no courtroom could contain. Rome had ruled. Religious leaders had condemned. Death had claimed its prize. And yet, none of it held, because the resurrection placed the final verdict beyond human reach. Jesus was alive, and those who had witnessed it could no longer pretend otherwise. When the verdict turned against the court, the resurrection did not end the trial of Jesus, it reversed it. What had been decided in secret, enforced by power, and sealed by death was now being questioned in the open. The very authorities who believed they had silenced him found themselves standing trial in the court of public truth. The disciples stepped out of hiding. The same men who once, scattered in fear, now spoke with clarity and courage that could not be explained by optimism alone. In the streets of Jerusalem, they told the story openly. Jesus had been crucified, buried, and raised. This was not rumor, it was testimony. They spoke as witnesses, not theorists. Crowds gathered. Some listened in disbelief. Others leaned in, compelled by conviction they could not ignore. The message was dangerous not because it challenged tradition, but because it exposed injustice. It declared that the leaders had condemned the innocent and that God had overturned their verdict. Power reacted the only way it knew how, by attempting control. The same council that questioned Jesus now summoned his followers. Threats replaced arguments. Orders were issued to remain silent, but silence was no longer possible. How could they deny what they had seen? Fear had lost its grip. Death no longer held authority over men who had watched it defeated. The response was simple and unyielding. Obedience to truth mattered more than obedience to power. Miracles followed their words, not as spectacle, but as confirmation. The sick were healed. The broken were restored. The message spread beyond Jerusalem, carried by voices that once trembled but now stood firm. The movement grew not through force, but through transformation. This growth terrified the authorities. Every healed life became evidence they could not erase. Every testimony reopened the trial they thought was finished. Jesus was no longer standing alone before accusers. He was standing in the lives of thousands who claimed his name. Attempts to suppress the movement only amplified it. Imprisonment became opportunity. Opposition became fuel. What was meant to intimidate only strengthened resolve. The trial had shifted. No longer was Jesus being questioned. Instead, the systems that condemned him were being exposed. The cross, once a symbol of shame, became a declaration of truth. The resurrection became the final appeal one no court could overturn. History was no longer asking, was Jesus guilty? It was asking, what will you do with the truth? Because a verdict rendered in fear can be reversed, but a verdict written by resurrection cannot be silenced. And the trial continued not in courts, but in hearts. When truth stepped beyond Jerusalem, Jerusalem was only the beginning. What started as a local trial confined to religious courts and Roman authority refused to stay contained. The message of Jesus crossed streets, crossed cities, and soon crossed borders. The truth that had been condemned in one place began to confront the entire world. The followers of Jesus did not carry weapons or political influence. They carried testimony. They spoke of what they had seen, what they had touched, what had changed them forever. This made their message unstoppable. It was not philosophy, it was experience. As the movement spread, new voices joined it. Ordinary people, fishermen, merchants, servants found themselves transformed into messengers. The message reached Samaria, then beyond, breaking long-standing barriers of race, culture, and status. The trial of Jesus was no longer about one man in one city. It had become a global question, and not everyone welcomed it. Authorities watched with growing alarm. Rome tolerated many religions, but it feared anything that challenged loyalty to Caesar. The claim that Jesus was Lord carried political weight whether his followers intended it or not. To declare allegiance to Christ was to quietly reject the empire's highest demand. Persecution followed. Believers were mocked, beaten, imprisoned, and in some cases killed. Yet the movement did not retreat. Suffering, instead of silencing them, sharpened their conviction. They had watched their teacher endure injustice without hatred. They followed the same path. One former enemy became the most unexpected witness. Saul of Tarsus had hunted followers of Jesus, believing them dangerous. But an encounter shattered his certainty. The man he believed to be dead confronted him with living authority. Saul became Paul, once a prosecutor, now a defender. The trial had claimed another witness. Paul carried the message across the Roman world into synagogues, marketplaces, and courts. Each city became a new courtroom. Each audience became a new jury. The question was no longer whether Jesus had risen. The question was whether people would respond. Kings heard it. Philosophers debated it. Prisoners embraced it. The message adapted without changing. It challenged minds, unsettled power, and healed hearts. The cross and resurrection redefined authority itself. Power no longer rested in force, but in truth. Victory no longer belonged to empires, but to transformation. The trial of Jesus had crossed borders, and now every nation stood implicated. Because when truth enters the world, when faith was tested by fire, as the message of Jesus moved deeper into the Roman world, resistance hardened into brutality. What had once been debate turned into persecution. The trial of Jesus was no longer argued with words, it was enforced with pain. His followers were now asked the same question he once faced: remain silent or suffer the consequences. They chose truth. Public loyalty to Jesus came at a cost. Believers were dragged before local governors, accused of defying Roman order. They were pressured to deny what they believed, to offer allegiance to Caesar as divine. Some complied out of fear, many did not. Their refusal was not rebellion, it was conviction. Executions followed, prisons filled with men and women whose only crime was belief. Families were torn apart, livelihoods were lost. In public arenas, believers were made examples meant to warn others not to follow the same path. Rome believed fear would succeed where argument had failed. It did not. Something unexpected happened under pressure. Faith did not collapse, it deepened. The same courage Jesus displayed during his trial appeared in those who followed him. They did not curse their executioners. They did not respond with violence. Many went to their deaths speaking forgiveness, echoing the words of the cross. Spectators noticed. People expected fear. They saw peace. They expected hatred. They witnessed hope. The power of Rome could take lives, but it could not take certainty. Death, once the empire's greatest weapon, lost its authority over those who believed it had already been defeated. Stories spread quickly, not just of suffering, but of unshakable faith. Each martyr became a testimony stronger than any sermon. Blood, meant to silence the message, amplified it. Even within Rome, the trial continued. Soldiers, officials, and household servants began to question what they were witnessing. Why did these people face death without terror? What truth made life expendable? The answer always led back to the same event, the resurrection. If death had truly been conquered, then fear no longer ruled. If Jesus had risen, then Rome's power was temporary and truth was eternal. The trial of Jesus was now being argued in the most brutal courtroom imaginable, the human soul under threat. And still, faith prevailed. History was being reshaped not by armies, but by conviction. When the empire faced its own judgment, Rome believed it ruled the world through strength, order, and fear. For centuries, its power went unquestioned. Yet the influence of Jesus executed as a criminal began to reach places no army could control. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the empire found itself facing a trial of its own. What began as persecution revealed a deeper problem. The more Rome attempted to crush the followers of Jesus, the more visible they became. Underground gatherings multiplied. House churches spread across cities and provinces. Faith moved quietly through families, trade routes, and even military ranks. It did not demand power. It transformed lives. Roman officials struggled to categorize the movement. Christians did not revolt. They paid taxes. They prayed for leaders. Yet they refused one-thing worship of the emperor. That refusal unsettled Rome more than open rebellion ever could. Loyalty divided was dangerous. Debates reached the highest levels of authority. Was this movement a threat, or merely a strange belief system that refused to disappear? Executions continued, but doubts grew. Killing believers did not end the problem. It exposed the limits of imperial power. Then history shifted. Centuries after the cross, a Roman emperor encountered the symbol Rome once used to terrify the world. The cross, once a tool of shame, appeared as a sign of victory. What followed changed everything. Christianity moved from forbidden faith to tolerated belief, and eventually to protected religion within the empire. The irony was impossible to ignore. Rome, which had condemned Jesus to death, now stood under the influence of his name. Buildings once dedicated to emperors were transformed into places of worship. The empire that enforced crucifixion now displayed the cross as a symbol of hope. This was not conquest by force. It was transformation by truth. The trial of Jesus had outlasted every courtroom, every execution, every emperor who tried to silence it. The verdict delivered at Golgotha was overturned not by rebellion, but by resurrection and endurance. Power shifted definitions. Strength was no longer measured by domination. Authority was no longer proven through violence. The life and trial of Jesus redefined leadership, justice, and sacrifice in ways the empire could never fully control. The question Rome once asked, "What shall we do with Jesus?" was answered not in words, but in history itself. Because when truth is executed and rises again, even empires must respond. A verdict still being decided. The trial of Jesus did not end in ancient courts or under Roman rule. It did not conclude with emperors, councils, or creeds. It continues quietly, persistently within every generation that encounters his story. The setting has changed, but the question remains the same. Who is he to you? Modern courts no longer call witnesses to testify about the crucifixion. Empires no longer debate his threat to political order, yet his influence remains unavoidable. His words are read, debated, criticized, and embraced across cultures and centuries. No other figure in history provokes such personal response. Some approach Jesus as a moral teacher. Others reduce him to legend or philosophy. Some reject him outright, uncomfortable with claims that demand more than admiration. These responses mirror the original trial. Curiosity, fear, denial, and conviction all return wearing modern language. The crowd still exists. Public opinion continues to shape belief. Social pressure replaces religious councils. Cultural acceptance replaces Roman authority. Silence is still the safer option. Commitment still carries risk. Following Jesus today may not involve physical chains, but it often requires standing against prevailing narratives. The trial plays out in quieter ways. In classrooms, his teachings challenge ambition and self-interest. In workplaces, integrity inspired by his words can cost advancement. In personal life, forgiveness modeled after his example confronts pride and resentment. Each moment forces a decision, convenience, or conviction. Jesus remains on trial not because evidence is lacking, but because his life demands response. Neutrality feels comfortable, but it is itself a verdict. Pilate's question echoes through time. What shall I do with Jesus? History shows that avoiding the decision does not erase its consequences. The power of his trial lies in its exposure of the human heart. It reveals fear when truth threatens control. It reveals courage when belief overcomes risk. It shows how easily justice bends under pressure and how unbreakable it becomes when anchored in truth. The resurrection remains the turning point. It refuses to stay in the past. It confronts doubt with reality. It challenges the assumption that death, failure, or fear have the final word. The trial of Jesus continues because his story continues. Every generation writes its own response, and one day, every verdict spoken or silent will be revealed for what it truly was. When humanity faced its reflection, the trial of Jesus was never only about one man. From the courtyard of Caiaphas to the Roman governor's hall, from the streets of Jerusalem to the corners of the world today, it has always been a mirror for humanity. Each accusation, each silence, each act of courage or cowardice reflects the choices we face when truth confronts us. In the original trial, the voices of the crowd, the whispers of the leaders, and even Pilate's hesitation reveals something profound. People are quick to judge when fear drives them, slow to act when truth demands sacrifice. The crucifixion, meant to end a movement, instead exposed the fragility of human justice and the resilience of divine purpose. Power tried to dominate, but it could not dominate conscience. Authority tried to enforce verdicts, but it could not contain conviction. Through it all, Jesus remained steadfast. He did not demand revenge, nor did he manipulate outcomes. His silence, his composure, his compassion even in the face of betrayal and torture exposed the emptiness of worldly authority. Where violence spoke, truth responded. Where hatred acted, forgiveness prevailed. Every act of cruelty highlighted his strength, and every act of courage in his followers echoed his example. The trial continues in every human heart. Whenever we are confronted with lies, injustice, or oppression, the question returns: will we follow fear or faith, convenience or conviction, compromise or courage? When we witness suffering, do we look away or intervene? When someone speaks truth we find uncomfortable, do we ridicule it or embrace it? Pilate's hands may no longer be visible, but the choice he faced is eternal. What will we do with Jesus? The resurrection transformed the trial into revelation. Death could not silence him, and history could not erase him. Every generation now participates in the verdict. Our choices, our courage, our silence or voice determine whether we stand with the crowd that demanded crucifixion or with the truth that endured beyond it. Ultimately, the trial of Jesus reveals the essence of humanity, its fear, its weakness, its capacity for cruelty, but also its potential for courage, integrity, and redemption. The verdict is no longer about him alone. It is about us, individually and collectively. And so, the trial continues not in courts, not in empires, but in the decisions we make every day when confronted by truth, justice, and love. courage rising from the cross. The story of Jesus' trial did not end on Golgotha, nor did it conclude with the empty tomb. Its true power lies in the way it transformed hearts, inspired courage, and challenged the patterns of fear and compromise that dominate human life. Every witness to his life, death, and resurrection became part of the ongoing trial, confronted with the same question the world has faced for centuries. Will I choose fear, or will I choose truth? Across the ancient world, his followers began to rise with a new resolve. Peter, once a disciple who denied him, became a bold messenger, preaching openly in streets that only hours before had been filled with fear. John, the beloved disciple, recorded the events, capturing both the suffering and the triumph so that the message could endure. These ordinary people, transformed by extraordinary truth, showed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. The trial extended far beyond Jerusalem. Every act of persecution became a stage for demonstration of steadfast faith. Communities across the Roman Empire watched as believers faced imprisonment, mocking, and even death, and chose forgiveness, love, and unwavering conviction. These acts were louder than the threats of soldiers or the decrees of rulers. Courage became contagious. Where cruelty sought to silence, faith spoke louder. Even today, the legacy of that trial continues. People across the globe, in every culture and language, are confronted with the challenge to live with integrity, to stand for justice, to love their enemies, and to forgive the unforgivable. The trial is no longer just historical, it is personal. Every ethical decision, every moral choice, echoes the same question that Pilate once asked: "What shall I do with Jesus?" And yet, the story also reveals hope. From the cross, humanity can learn that even the gravest injustice does not have the final word. Even in moments of betrayal, suffering, and fear, courage has the power to transform history. The trial was meant to break him, but it strengthened those who followed him. It was intended to silence the message, but it amplified it. The trial of Jesus reminds us that courage is born in the crucible of adversity. When faced with fear, when confronted by injustice, when tempted to compromise, the choice remains ours: to act with integrity, to speak truth, and to embody love is to participate in a verdict that death, power, or fear cannot overturn. The eternal verdict of truth. The trial that began in the shadows of Caiaphas' courtyard moved through the halls of Pilate and reached the hill of Golgotha did not end with death. It continues in every heart that encounters the story, in every generation that wrestles with truth, fear, and choice. And now, in this final reflection, the trial of Jesus stands as a timeless lesson on justice, courage, and the unshakable power of truth. From the first false accusations to the mockery and scourging, from the crucifixion to the empty tomb, every stage revealed more than human weakness, it revealed divine purpose. Jesus faced a system built to suppress, a crowd driven by fear, and rulers clinging to power. Yet in every moment, he remained steadfast, unshaken, and obedient to a higher calling. His trial exposed the fragility of worldly authority and the resilience of righteousness. The resurrection transformed the verdict. Death, the final judge, failed to hold sway. The tomb could not silence him. Darkness could not extinguish his light. Those who once fled in fear became bold witnesses. Ordinary people became carriers of an extraordinary message. Courage rose from the cross. Hope rose from the grave. The trial intended to destroy a man ended up transforming the world. The eternal lesson is clear. Truth cannot be permanently silenced, and love cannot be defeated by cruelty. Authority may enforce laws, and fear may influence crowds, but integrity, faith, and justice endure beyond temporal power. The trial of Jesus calls each person to confront the same question. What will I do when faced with truth that challenges my comfort, my pride, or my security? Will I choose fear, compromise, and conformity, or courage, conviction, and faith? The verdict is no longer about condemnation. It is about alignment with the eternal, choosing truth, even in the face of persecution, transforms ordinary lives into instruments of hope. The cross, once a symbol of shame, now stands as a beacon of courage. The empty tomb, once a site of grief, now stands as a declaration of victory over death, despair, and injustice. The trial of Jesus ended in a way no human court could foresee. Not with punishment, but with redemption. Not with silence, but with eternal testimony. Not with defeat, but with triumph. History, power, fear, and death are temporary. Truth is eternal, and the verdict, already written, yet still being lived. Those who embrace it are free. Those who deny it are still in trial. And the world continues to witness the ultimate triumph of truth.